first time. I joined NRGI just the third day. He was in Ghana here already, engaging Ministry of Finance and other stakeholders, at the time being supported by Africa Development Bank with the support of NRGI. So Tom is very knowledgeable when it comes to the economic dimensions of mineral extractions, of oil and gas, and all of that. And you are safe in his hands. He's also able to handle all of your questions after the presentation when you have them. So Tom, if you are available, I would ask that you all help me to welcome Tom Skeffel to take us through the presentation. Tom, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazir. And yes, I remember that at first, sorry, there's a bit of feedback. Maybe if you could mute at your end. Yeah, I remember the first time we met. It was a very wet day in Accra, and we were driving back to the office from a hotel on the outskirts. But yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you all today. Many thanks for joining both at the hotel and virtually. I think this is a really valuable opportunity for NRGI to feed into these important discussions on Ghana's fiscal regime and specifically on its minority state equity in the mining sector. So yeah, we're very appreciative of this opportunity. So in this presentation, I'll set out our analysis of Ghana's current regime, Gate's proposed reforms, and then some suggestions of our own. I'll share the slide deck after the presentation for information. And because it is for information, the slides are maybe a little denser than I would normally make a slide deck that I'm presenting, but I wanted to make sure that all our sort of thinking was down on paper for you to refer to after this session. So I hope this sort of does the job of balancing those two objectives. Please stop me if you need any sort of clarifications, but if there are any other sort of broader questions or comments, then yeah, we can go through those after the presentation. But before I get on to our analysis of the current regime, I guess I thought it'd be useful just to put a few introductory slides together to set out our understanding of the sector. But we'll just.
Hello, Tom.
Yes, Nader.
Yes, you proceed. I mean, it would be nice that you put on your video so that participants can see you in particular.
Okay. Sure. Can you see me now?
That's okay.
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay. Yeah. So just a few introductory slides to set out our understanding of the sector. So yeah, Ghana's mining sector currently dominated by gold. Existing gold mines appear to be performing strongly, though some of that increase over the last few years is from the small scale sector, but the large scale gold mining sector also appears to be producing at pretty high levels at the moment. But importantly, more investment is going to be needed in existing or new mines over the next few years. This is the chart that you can see on this slide is from S&P Global, and it's a forecast of gold production from the large scale sector over the next couple of decades based on current investment plans. And what you can see is that within a few years, production will start to decline pretty rapidly, even after accounting for the new Ahafo North and Namdini mines. So yeah, some of the existing mines will have additional reserves. So this isn't to say that, well, once we get to 2025, the existing mines won't be able to produce anymore. But to extract those additional reserves, further investment will be needed to explore and extract them. And if there's not that investment in existing mines, then you'll need investment in new mines just to maintain production levels. This is, given the nature of finite, of the sector, the fact that these resources are finite, I don't think this is going to be news to anyone. And obviously, every country grapples with this, how to replace their reserves. But the urgency, the need for new investment in Ghana, does appear to be quite significant. And the prospects for more investment appear mixed. So looking at exploration, and as was discussed in the first meeting about these reforms, there does seem to be an issue around exploration spending in Ghana. So the chart on this slide shows exploration spend by a selection of countries as a percentage of global spend. Ghana is this orange line here. And as you can see, there's been a slight increase over the last few years, but over the past decade, several of Ghana's competitors have had larger exploration spend than Ghana. And my understanding is that much of this exploration spend in Ghana is brownfield exploration within existing mining areas rather than greenfield exploration of new mining areas. So there may be, this suggests that maybe sort of the prospects for new mines in the next few years are pretty limited. Then when it comes to costs, again, as was discussed at the last meeting, Ghana's mines, or at least when it comes to gold mines, look like they have higher costs than the global average. So this chart shows the global cost curve for gold mines, with low costs on the left-hand side of the chart and high cost mines on the right-hand side of the chart. And you can see that most of Ghana's mines are on the right-hand side. So this is potentially another challenge for investment. And then finally, when it comes to revenues, they've been increasing over the last few years, but and the reason we're here, payment of dividends from state equity have remained quite low. Though based on Gatey's paper on the proposed reforms around state equity, my understanding is that in 2020 maybe there was a sort of a larger payment of state equity dividends as a result of advance payments based on some of the development agreements. But government officials and other stakeholders have suggested that these payments are still lower than expected. But further analysis is needed to determine why that is the case. But we're here to kind of look at what the options are for reforming state equity, kind of irrespective of that reason. So the key questions that our analysis looks at are: one, is Ghana's fiscal regime striking the right balance between government revenues and competitiveness? Two, how do Gate's proposed reforms to state equity affect this balance? And three, what other options are there for making the fiscal regime work better for Ghana? So we analysed the fiscal regime in legislation, not in the development agreement. And this is because most of the agreements have been renegotiated recently. So we believe that renegotiating them again would be risky for investor confidence. And doing so would, the potential costs of doing so would outweigh the potential benefits. And therefore, we think that any reform should focus on new mines. Though we do note the fact that there are some existing mines without development agreements, and that they would likely be impacted by any reforms to legislation. So we take that into account when we're thinking about what reforms would make sense. So our analysis is based on gold, given Ghana will likely continue producing more of it than other minerals for the foreseeable future. And we compared gold to other large Ghana gold producers, primarily in the region, modelling the impact of their regimes on two hypothetical mines. So we developed these mine profiles using project economic data for Ghana's mines from the S&P Global database, which provides data on both actual performance, so historical performance to date, and then projected performance based on company information and their own sort of independent analysis. So these two mine profiles, the more profitable mine and the less profitable mine, are intended to be representative of the two types of gold mine in Ghana, but not specific to any individual mine in Ghana. But yeah, we're looking at gold, mainly because that's going to be the largest source of production for the foreseeable future. But also that was the focus of the proposed reforms set out by Gate and the discussion surrounding that. If we were to look at to consider the regime for the minerals, that would require additional modelling and looking at how the regimes in other countries focusing on those minerals, say bauxite, iron ore, compare. Though we do think some of the dynamics of the regime would obviously be applicable across all minerals. But yeah, just important to keep that in mind. So we always start any tax analysis by looking at the wider investment climate, because what tax level strikes the right balance between generating government revenue and competitiveness does depend on that wider investment climate. And as the Gate technical working group paper points out, Ghana actually does appear to offer relatively strong, or has a relatively strong investment climate, offers relatively strong non-fiscal incentives for investment. Various surveys suggest that Ghana offers reasonable political stability, policy predictability, regulatory quality, a couple of examples on this slide are the Fraser Institute survey, which is an annual survey of mining companies and investors. And then at the bottom is the World Governance Indicators done by the World Bank. So we think that Ghana's wider investment climate offers sort of a strong building blocks for the sector and provides a bit more scope for higher taxes than potentially in other countries. There are some challenges. So, for example, surveys still suggest that infrastructure challenges remain. And if we were thinking about bauxite or iron ore, where the transport infrastructure needs are a lot more significant than for a gold mine, then we'd have to sort of take that into account when thinking about the regime for those minerals. But overall, the wider investment climate appears pretty strong. So onto our analysis itself. So first we look at sort of the average tax level. So looking at those two mine profiles, assuming a gold price of 1,400 ounces, given that's the median over the average over the last 10 years, how does Ghana compare to other gold producers in the region? And we found through our modelling that Ghana's tax level appears to be slightly higher than the regional average. As you can see, on both the charts, Tanzania, DRC, Guinea all have a slightly higher government take. Mali, Burkina Faso, South Africa, a slightly lower government take. But yeah, Ghana's tax level maybe is slightly higher than the regional average. So that means that the regime should be capturing significant government revenue if it's being administered effectively. But then in terms of sort of the competitiveness, given Ghana's relatively strong non-fiscal incentives, we don't think that this slightly higher tax level should really be impacting that competitiveness, given that Ghana offers stronger non-fiscal incentives than some of the other countries in this group. But I mean, as you all know, the average tax level doesn't indicate how the regime performs in other ways. And there are a number of qualities that a regime ideally would have. So flexibility to respond to the uncertainty about how profitable a mine will be. Simple, so the taxes can be monitored and collected effectively. Reliable, so there's always some revenue coming into the budget, and predictable. So investors are actually willing to put their money in because they know that they can get their money out later on. These are all desirable features of a fiscal regime, but as you'll know, there are trade-offs between them. Your flexible instruments are profit-based instruments that are more complex than your royalties, which are much simpler to monitor and collect. But simple instruments like royalties aren't flexible. They're not going to change that much or at all, depending on the structure of the royalty, when profits change. So if you want a simple instrument to be flexible, then you're going to have to keep changing changing it, which then means it's not predictable. So like all countries, Ghana is going to have to strike a balance between those different qualities. But in our analysis, we look at how the regime performs in terms of its flexibility, and then we look at how it performs in terms of its simplicity as well. And in terms of its flexibility, well, we don't, according to our modeling, Ghana's regime is not very flexible. So this chart shows government take at different profit levels, with low profits on the left-hand side and increasing profits as you move to the right. And as you can see on the right-hand side, Ghana being the dashed orange line, the regime does a decent job of capturing windfall profits if the regime is administered effectively. But if you look at what's happening at low profit levels, it doesn't provide relief to less profitable mines. So the regime is likely to be deterring investment in marginal mines and in mine expansions where companies have to go into areas of the mining area that are a higher cost. And this is likely to be particularly impactful for Ghana, given the fact that many of its mines are higher cost. And this lack of flexibility seems to partly result from the recently introduced national health and education levies. So whereas before these were included as part of VAT and could be recovered as VAT is when a mine exports, now they have to be paid separately, and they're not refunded at any point. And given the fact that these are paid as soon as exploration commences and continue to be paid as long as the mine, throughout the mine's lifetime, even if it's making no or low profit, then this really impacts the regime's flexibility. So even low profit mines are having to pay this, and because these levies are based on cost, higher cost mines have to actually end up paying a higher amount. So Ghana's regime is in sort of stark contrast to a couple of the other regimes in this chart. Looking at, for example, Côte d'Ivoire, which is the green line at the bottom, and South Africa, which is the dark blue, they provide a lot more relief to mines when they're not making much profit, and that's because they don't have these levies on inputs, but also because Côte d'Ivoire has a variable rate royalty that varies with price. South Africa has a variable rate royalty that actually varies with operating profit. So the royalty rate is lower when operating profit is low, and higher when operating profit is high. And then when it comes to the simplicity of Ghana's regime, we find that, actually, despite these levies, Ghana's regime relies on complex profit-based taxes more than several other regimes that we analysed. So this chart shows the proportion of modelled revenue coming from different types of taxes. So your light blue is inputs, your dark blue is production, your yellow is operating profit, orange is corporate profit, and then the red is equity returns. And as you can see in the chart, the likes of Burkina Faso, Tanzania, Mali, all have taxes on sales revenues, or generate more revenue from taxes on sales revenues from production, than Ghana does. So Ghana's regime is more exposed to tax avoidance risks than these other countries, because they're relying on the more complex profit-based taxes more than these other countries. And then in terms of the state equity, you can see that a lot of countries across Africa do have minority state equity. So Ghana isn't unusual in this sense, but as we all know, like state equity, minority state equity, is more complicated to monitor and more prone to avoidance than even your corporate income tax, windfall profit tax payments, given the higher risk of excessive borrowing by companies. That isn't to say that that's not me saying that that's why Ghana is getting less dividends from its state equity than it expected. As I set out earlier, further analysis is needed on that, and I know that that's been a recommendation from the GATE technical working group to the government on this. So I'm not suggesting that the reason for the low dividend payments is avoidance, but that is a risk, and that's what this chart sets out. So that was the current regime and our assessment of it. So we think that the average tax level is pretty strong. It's slightly higher than the regional average, but given Ghana's strong non-fiscal incentives, we think it strikes actually a pretty good balance between generating government revenue from existing mines and being competitive and encouraging investment. But we do think that it's slightly less flexible than is optimal, particularly in relation to its burden on less profitable mines. And then because of its reliance on profit-based taxes and state equity, it's not a particularly simple regime, and therefore avoidance risks are slightly higher than ideal. But addressing these weaknesses is challenging because, as I set out on that slide with the triangle, if you want a simpler regime, is going to be less flexible, but we're really looking for more flexibility rather than less flexibility to improve Ghana's competitiveness. So it's finding a way to thread that needle and improve both flexibility and simplicity that will be key to Ghana's regime generating more revenue, or Ghana's mining sector generating more revenue going forward. So I'm now going to turn to GATE's proposals. And as you know, GATE has proposed 4 reforms to state equity. Initially, it proposed exchanging the equity for a 10% production share, exchanging the equity for 1% higher royalty, and introducing advanced dividend payments for other mines, as well as those that for which there already is that arrangement. And then subsequently, it's proposed 10% carried equity as we understand it, in an unincorporated JV with payment in kind. So in the next section, I'm going to go through our analysis of that. But before I do, we had to, because Gaiety hasn't proposed a specific structure to the advanced dividend payments, and because they can be configured in several ways, we had to sort of decide on a structure ourselves to model the impact. And we chose one that was based on production value, so in line with that in the Newmont AKM development agreement, given that that's simpler for government to measure than profit. But given that this makes those payments less flexible, because they're going to have to be paid whenever production is taking place after a certain period, we set the rate at a level that didn't increase or limited the burden on less profitable mines. So we set it at 1%, which is actually slightly higher than the Newmont rate of 0.6%. But we think this rate would still limit the burden on less profitable mines, at least according to our modelling. So in terms of the average tax level, firstly, I mean, and as the Gaiety technical working groups have determined, sort of subsequently swapping equity for a 10% production share would make the regime uncompetitive. So that's the green bar in those charts, regime D, with the average tax level much higher than any of its competitors. The 1% royalty and the advanced dividend payments result in a lower tax level than a slightly lower tax level than the current regime, if we assume that the current regime is perfectly administered and dividends are paid in full. But based on sort of recent experience, we can assume that that's not going to be the case, that dividend payments are going to be lower than that. So these charts actually differentiate between the tax level when the regime is perfectly administered and when dividend payments aren't made. So for example, with the current regime, this orange bar, the darker orange is if dividend payments are not paid, and then the lighter part of the bar is if dividend payments are paid. So you can see with the yellow bar and the red bar, which is when a 1% royalty is increased by 1% to replace equity, and then advanced dividend payments are introduced, that if we assume that very little dividend payments are made, then actually those regimes do generate a similar amount of or even slightly more revenue than the current regime. And either way, we think they still generate a pretty good balance between government revenues and competitiveness. In terms of the carried equity, well, that really depends on the carried interest rate and mine profitability. With a higher carried interest rate and lower mine profitability, resulting in a lower tax level than the current regime. Then in terms of flexibility, again, regime D, which is the swapping the equity for a 10% production share, that's much less flexible than the current regime, given that production share would have to be paid whether the mine is making profit or not. And the higher royalty and the advanced dividend payments also slightly increase or reduce the flexibility of the regime, because again, they're being paid even if a mine is making no or low profit. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, your yellow line is no equity with higher royalty, and your green line is advanced dividend payments. The tax level is higher than the current regime when profits are low. So those reforms would reduce the flexibility of the regime further. And then carried equity would have a similar amount of flexibility to free equity. And then finally on simplicity, given you're swapping, your equity, a complex sort of instrument for collecting revenue for 10% production share, 1% royalty, or even advanced dividends if they're based on production, for a much simpler instrument, those regimes, those reforms would improve the simplicity of the regime. They would reduce the risk of tax avoidance. Carried equity would be pretty similar to the current regime, given its sort of structure is the same as the current regime in terms of its base. So I guess one of the key messages is whether Ghana's equity is free or carried, whether it's incorporated or unincorporated, it will likely face the same avoidance risks. I don't really have time to go through this worked example, but maybe you could look at it when I share the slides later. But it just sets out how in a hypothetical scenario, if one of the causes of low dividend payments for state equity is excess borrowing, then whether you structure your JV to be incorporated or unincorporated, you're not changing those avoidance risks. And really, there's no form of minority state equity that's going to be a silver bullet to reduce those avoidance risks. What is key is the rules that are governing the state's rights as a shareholder. So what's in the law and what's in your JV agreement about the decisions that the state as a shareholder has to be involved in, the information that it is able to access, and then the capacity and the commitment of the state to contribute to operational decisions and review information. So who sits on the board and management committees and how active they are in their role. That's what's going to determine whether Ghana can get more from its minority state equity, not whether the equity is free or carried or incorporated or unincorporated. And really, even with sort of the right rules in place and the right people on the board, there is still going to be limited influence given it's a minority stake. So there is really no silver bullet if minority state equity is retained at its current size and it's not exchanged for something else. So just to sort of summarize that, I think my main takeaway when analysing Gately's proposals was really that they highlight how difficult it is to find the right balance for a fiscal regime, any fiscal regime. As I've said, converting free equity to carried equity has little impact on its performance. But then when you're swapping equity for a production share or a higher royalty, you're making the regime simpler, and therefore you're reducing tax avoidance risks. But you're also making the regime less flexible. So you're potentially deterring investment. You're making the regime less competitive. So we're unsure of whether those reforms really make sense for Ghana and its regime. We do think, though, that advanced dividends are worth considering further if combined with other reforms, given that they can be structured to kick in at a later stage of the mine's lifetime. There is some flexibility in terms of at what price they are paid, and they enable the government to retain some state equity, which means that they can avoid a sort of a potentially politically challenging decision whether to move away from state equity, and it allows them to retain the potential for some non-fiscal benefits. So based on all of that, we then looked at the regime and what other reforms could be made, and looking at reforms that could potentially thread the needle between, or better thread the needle between, flexibility and simplicity. And these reforms really aim to just sort of fine-tune the regime, given we think it's already, it's not in need of a fundamental sort of overhaul. So one option to increase simplicity that won't sacrifice as much flexibility as, for example, just a fixed higher royalty is exchanging state equity for a variable rate royalty, a royalty that will vary with price. So we looked at introducing a variable rate royalty that is slightly more likely to have a rate of 6% rather than the current 5% based on historical prices, which obviously isn't always a brilliant predictor of the future, but provides some sense of where prices might go over the next mining cycle. But that rate will vary with price. But two things to note. One is we didn't look at removing state equity completely. We just looked at reducing it to 5%, which again is as a result of sort of the acknowledgement that state equity is we find generally quite popular with the public, and therefore politically challenging to remove, but also because it has the potential to generate some non-fiscal benefits if we said the rules are right and the capacity and the commitment is there to utilize them. So we looked at introducing this variable rate royalty and reducing state equity from 10% to 5%. And then the second thing to note is that while we think that the variable rate royalty does allow some increased flexibility, that it does mean that the royalty rate will be slightly more responsive to profitability. Costs often do follow prices, and therefore prices aren't always a good indicator of profitability. So that means we've limited the amount that the royalty rate can increase even when prices are really high, because we don't want to risk mines becoming unprofitable even when there is a price boom. And then we've limited the amount that the royalty rate can fall even when prices are really low, because one, royalty revenues are important for providing a reliable revenue stream to the budget, but two, because some of that royalty revenue goes directly to mining areas, and therefore we don't want to reduce that by too much. But this was one proposal around how to increase simplicity, so change some of that complicated state equity for a simpler instrument, without sacrificing too much flexibility. And then another reform we looked at was around these education and health funds that were recently restructured. As I set out, these have quite a big impact on flexibility. And actually even swapping these for, say, a slightly higher royalty rate would increase flexibility, because at least the royalty is only being paid when production is taking place rather than from the start of the start of exploration. And also royalties are not related to cost, and therefore it's not the high cost mines that are being impacted. But we're aware that these levies were only sort of properly introduced in 2018. They apply to all sectors, and they directly fund health and education projects. So it'll be very difficult to actually remove these from the regime. So what we looked at was how to restructure them to reduce their impact on flexibility. And this involves offsetting them against corporate income tax. So currently, these levies are deducted from taxable income before corporate income tax is paid. What we're suggesting is that they're actually, when a corporate income tax bill is calculated, these levies are deducted from the amount of corporate income tax that is due, as this will result in will reduce the impact of them will increase the impact of them on the level of corporate income tax that will be due. Because if you're deducting them for every dollar of paid in a levy, if you're deducting them from taxable income, you're only recouping 35 cents. So you're only recouping how much corporate income tax you would have paid on that dollar of profit. But if you're offsetting them, you get to deduct the whole amount. You recoup the whole dollar, because you're knocking that amount off the corporate income tax payment. So you're reducing the impact of these levies on the regime, and because less profitable mines will pay less corporate income tax, offsetting the levy will have a larger impact on those mines. So in this sort of, again, worked example that I won't go through in detail, you can see that when you're deducting the levy, the effective tax rate for more profitable mines and less profitable mines is the same at 35%. But if you're offsetting the levies, your more profitable mine will be paying an effective tax rate of 33%, and your less profitable mine will be paying an effective tax rate of 22%. So there'll be a much bigger impact on your less profitable mines. So we looked at combining these reforms. So the exchanging the variable, reducing the state equity and introducing a variable rate royalty and this levy offset. We also looked at combining the levy offset with advanced dividend payments to see if that could counter some of the negative impact that the advanced dividend payments have on flexibility. And another option for addressing avoidance risks that we didn't model is swapping equity in the project company for equity in the parent company. So along the lines of the approach taken with the, and I'm really sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this, but the Obuasi mine, where the government has taken a stake in AngloGold Ashanti's parent company. This seems like quite a promising approach, given it will reduce those avoidance risks from excessive borrowing between the project company and the parent company. It also means a more diversified revenue stream, because AngloGold Ashanti's, or the global company, won't be sort of tied to the performance of Ghana's mining sector specifically. But it would eliminate most of the non-fiscal benefits, and determining what that global stake would be, how to make it equivalent to the sort of the 10% stake in the project company is obviously very complex. So I'd be interested to hear what the experience has been with the stake in AngloGold Ashanti, though I know that that's a recent arrangement. So maybe there's not yet that much sort of sense of how that's going. But I think that's another option to consider. We didn't look at adding a windfall profit tax to the regime. And that's because while companies may not ultimately pay it, they will factor the possibility of paying that into their investment decision. And given Ghana already has a slightly higher average tax level than the regional average, adding that into the regime without exchanging it for another tax would probably make the regime less competitive. And we didn't think it made sense to exchange it for state equity, because they're both very complex instruments to administer, and therefore you're not really gaining that much in terms of simplicity. But then if you swap it for, say, a lower royalty rate, then you are increasing your flexibility, but you're worsening simplicity. So you've got that trade-off again. So we didn't look at that. In terms of the reforms we did look at, so regime H, so that's the combination of lower equity, the variable rate royalty, and the levy offset. That has a slightly lower tax level than the current regime, and that's because the levy offset does reduce the corporate income tax bill to some extent, and lowering your equity and introducing a variable rate royalty also slightly reduces taxes for more profitable mines, because those mines should be paying quite a lot in state equity dividends, and we limited the amount that the variable rate royalty increases because of that risk of an excessive burden on less profitable mines. But again, if we assume dividend payments are minimal, the difference between the current regime and regime H actually isn't that significant. And that's also the case if you with the regime that combines advanced dividends with the levy offset. And then in terms of flexibility, so as hoped, the levy offset increases flexibility. As you can see in the on the left-hand side of the chart, where we're looking at mines that aren't making much profit, the purple line is the levy offset on its own, and that's lower than that has a lower burden on less profitable mines than the current regime. And then if you combine that with the variable rate royalty, which will have a lower royalty rate when prices are lower, then you've got a much lower burden on less profitable mines. But actually, for mines with higher profits, you're capturing almost as much profit because you've got a higher royalty rate and you've still got 5% state equity. So that combination does result in a slightly more flexible regime than the current one. And then when it comes to simplicity, these regimes also provide better protection against tax avoidance as intended, because you're reducing your state equity and increasing the royalty rate slightly on average. And then when it comes to advanced dividend payments, you will get those even if a mine isn't paying out dividends. So you've got a slightly simpler regime and therefore lower tax avoidance risks. So just to sum up, we think that regime, which combines a lower state equity, a variable rate royalty with a slightly higher average royalty rate, and the levy offset, is slightly simpler and more flexible than the current regime. The government will still have to make trade-offs. Every government does. So one, because we are looking to increase the simplicity of the regime, we can't increase its flexibility too much, just given the nature of the instruments that we have to be able to do that. And that means the average tax level has to be slightly lower to avoid that excessive burden on less profitable mines. And despite that, because we are swapping equity, which is only paid when a mine is making profits, for royalty, which is paid whenever it's producing, there is still going to be a slightly higher burden on mines making less profits, even though we've tried to mitigate that with the levy offset. It's just unavoidable to completely escape those trade-offs. But despite them, we do think that that regime strikes a slightly better balance than the current regime, and the same goes for the regime that incorporates advance payments, dividend payments, rather than the variable rate royalty. So just finally, before I finish, and I realize I've been talking for a long time, just to re-emphasize, we think that these rate reforms should be primarily aimed at new mines. But as we said, we realize there's this concern that there are existing mines that don't have development agreements, which would be potentially impacted by any changes to legislation. The challenge is if those mines are exempt, then you're making the transition, which I know the government wants to make, to a legislation-based system where mines to a large extent operate under legislation rather than under agreements in the long term, you make that sort of, you push that point sort of even further away. So we would suggest applying these reforms to, or discussing applying these reforms to existing mines without development agreements as well. But whilst we were developing these reforms, we had that in mind, and we do think these mines will likely welcome the proposed levy offset. So they may be willing to accept the reforms to state equity in exchange. We hope that there's something in these reforms for everyone. But of course, consultation is key, and the government could consider a transition period to help them adjust to any changes that are made to the regime. That's all I have for now. That's our analysis. I hope you've found that useful. I'm aware that we covered a lot, and though I very greedily took an hour of your time, I'm aware that we still sort of covered a lot of content in that time. So please let me know if you have any questions, and if we don't get to cover them in this session, then I'm always available for a chat or an email exchange after this session, but I'll be sharing the slide deck after this session anyway. So thank you very much for listening, and Nazir, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, for covering this much content. I think that we've got to do it this way so that we are able to get the opinion of those online as well. I think we have as many as 16, 17 other participants joining online. So we will take the first 3 comments or first 3 questions, depending on how it comes, from within the room here. And once Tom deals with that, we can then move to those joining us virtual to also see who has comments or questions to ask. Then we can revert back again. So we can take that in 3 successive sessions, and then we can bring a closure to this. So if you agree with it. So for those who are in here, if you have a question, then you can let us know so we can pass on. I think Dr. Mantia is starting. Okay.
Thank you, Thomas, for a very well-researched and well-analyzed presentation. But for a starter, I need to set the premise for which we are considering this reform. The evidence shows that all over the world, countries that have been able to maximize their returns from their resource sector are those that are not playing the role of spectators, but are active participants in the exploitation of the resource, either directly or through their private sector. And so you look at UK, and you see BP is a dominant player. A lot of times, Ghanaians compare Obuasi with South Africa. But what we overlook is the fact that South African gold is being exploited predominantly by South African companies. So there is greater value retention within the South African economy. In Ghana, we have arrogated to ourselves the role of spectators. We have no equity participation. We're not arguing for us to establish a state-owned gold mining company. But at least to the extent that the business is profitable, the only way we can ensure value retention, greater value retention, would be to buy into profitable mines. And so this proposal to convert our carried interest into paid interest is with a view to increasing value retention in our mining sector. Unless the data shows that the mines are not profitable, then it's not worth buying into them. But if they are profitable, then of course, in my view, it makes sense to find innovative ways of having a share of the profit. Now, you looked at some of the determinants of competitiveness, and you touched based on tax, which made me a bit uncomfortable. You know why? Because it has been the bane of the poor outcomes of revenues to government in the West African sub-region. Because in years back, it's period what we describe, or the literature describes as the race to the bottom. So if Ghana wants to attract more investors, then the only way is to undo or outdo Burkina Faso by lowering its tax. That, for me, will not be the way to go. UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, has done studies that show that investors consider far more factors far more beyond, taxes. They consider, for instance, the quality of the workforce. And Ghana has abundance, and we export a lot of mining expertise into the West African sub-region. Infrastructure relative to our competitors, I think we are ahead of them. A lot of them, for instance, Mali, Burkina Faso, these are Sahel countries with infrastructure that come no near Ghana's infrastructure. Talk about power. Mali generation of power is basically driven by, fossil fuel. And they operate, these are small generators that are not very efficient compared to power generation that Ghana affords mining companies. So when you put all these together, I cannot see how, for instance, Mali will be more competitive, or Burkina Faso will be more competitive, especially also when you take into account that ours is a matured industry. There's greater certainty of finding the gold than in Mali or Burkina Faso. So I think that we need to consider much more beyond the fiscals, consider other advantages that Ghana has that the others do not have, and for which reason I believe that we still will remain attractive destination in spite of the relatively high tax rates. Ghana, again, let me just cite before I close on this submission. Ghana, our current fiscal regime in under the free zones enclave arrangement provides zero rate corporate income tax to companies that set up in rural areas outside the big cities. Over the about 20 years of implementation of this policy, companies continue to site in the big cities, Accra, Kumasi, and the rest, shying away from the zero rate concession given them in the rural areas. Why is it so? I guess it's so because of the advantages that siting up in the cities afford them in spite of the tax incentives provided by the free zones arrangement. So I think we need to be look at the issues in a much broader context than we currently are. Thank you.
Those were comments to aspects of the presentation made by Tom. I'm sure that Tom may want to give a comment, some response back. Otherwise, we'll go to the next person if there are questions within the room still before we can go to those online. Tom, if you think that any aspect of what Dr. Mantiel has just commented on, you probably want to have some form of a response to it, I think you are okay to do that. That is in the absence of any other question within the room. Then we can move to those who are joining us virtual.
Okay, yeah, if I could come in. Thank you, Dr. Machu, for your comments, and give me an opportunity, hopefully, to clarify a couple of things that maybe weren't clear as a result of me trying to rush through my presentation. Obviously, it still took a while. On your comment about the relationship between competitiveness and the tax level, I completely agree. And we've found, but as you said, the race to the bottom has not worked. And in fact, companies are increasingly skeptical of overly concessionary regimes because they know from bitter experience, say for example in Tanzania, that if you agree a deal that is unfair to a country, that at some point that will come back to haunt you. So in the case of Acacia, they signed a deal in the 90s that was far too one-sided. Come 2017, they've been kicked out of the country, and there's been huge change in the legal framework. So low taxes result in a greater risk of policy unpredictability, a greater risk of not being able to get your return once you put money into a country. So yes, I completely agree that the race to the bottom hasn't worked, and that is definitely not what I'm proposing. And in fact, as I set out, I think given the strong non-fiscal incentives that Ghana has, which you set out and which I set out in this slide, I think that the fact that Ghana has a slightly higher tax level than the regional average isn't a problem for Ghana's competitiveness. That the non-fiscal incentives that Ghana has compared to the likes of Burkina Faso and Mali mean that they can have a slightly higher tax level than those countries. So I'm not suggesting Ghana should be lowering its tax level to compete with those other countries. There is a trade-off between the tax level and competitiveness at the extremes, of course. So if Ghana's tax level was significantly higher than any other country, then that maybe would be a deterrent to investment. But the fact that Ghana has those strong non-fiscal incentives means that it can have a higher average tax level than many of its regional peers, and that will not impact competitiveness. So I completely agree with you on that, and sorry if that wasn't clear. On the question of state equity, I guess I have sort of two thoughts on the proposal to buy into mines. One is whether buying a stake rather than just having a free stake actually generates significantly more, or addresses the challenges that Ghana is already facing with its state equity in terms of dividend payments. I would argue, as I set out, that as long as the governance framework around state participation isn't addressed. Sorry, just realizing I thought I was sharing my screen when I was addressing these questions, but I wasn't. Apologies for that. But yeah, as long as those governance issues aren't addressed, then a minority stake, whether it's paid for or paid for up front, whether it's carried, whether it's gotten for free, it's still going to be challenging to address some of those underlying issues that result in lower dividends. But I agree that state participation and not being a spectator can be useful for a country, and that's why in my proposal around the variable rate royalty, I'm not suggesting that that is exchanged for completely replaces state equity, but just state equity is reduced to 5%. That will, if dividends are paid, then that will result in lower dividends, but you're still getting those non-fiscal benefits. And to be honest, the difference between the non-fiscal benefits you're going to get with a 10% stake and a 5% stake are pretty minimal. You're really only going to have the size of the stake really only matters once you're talking about taking a much larger stake. And then I guess my question is, given the amount of funds required to purchase a stake of that size, what the opportunity cost of that is, given all the other funding, spending requirements and needs that Ghana has. So, yeah, I completely agree with the principle of your argument. I would just question maybe whether paying for a stake really does make much difference to the sort of the potential benefits than getting it for free and between sort of 5% and 10% equity size.
All right, thank you so much. I think there's another question at the back there. Maybe after that, we will just give an opportunity for those online to also ask their questions. I think this is Mr. Ben. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think that's a very brilliant work. And I agree with a lot of the comments you did make. I understand the challenges that are associated with government trying to improve its stake within the context of a minority interest. It's not that simple. It's quite a complex setting, and one could not a priori just say what the outcomes would be. Indeed, as you rightly did, even your results were based on certain assumptions that you made, which led to certain results. Tweaking of those assumptions could change to some extent some of the outcomes. But it is a matter of fact that government would need to make certain trade-offs to be able to achieve certain results in the end. But then the balance between the different types of fiscal regimes, getting the right balance, it's not that simple. And even for us, if we wanted to explore further, we need to do further analysis. So I agree fully with that perspective. So my question though is, the proposal that if we are going to make any reforms, it should apply to the new mines. But we have quite a number of our big mines existing now. So what do we do to those? How do we get to improve the government take on those ones? That's the question I want to you to address your mind
to. Okay, I think Tom, we will take a final one before you, so that you can take both of them together. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. I think I was thinking about.
It's good. I wanted us to for us to relate to who is speaking.
Okay, Samuel Bequin.
All right. Yeah.
Mr. I think you mentioned what I was actually thinking about. And first of all, I would say, Tom, very interesting presentation, and we have been discussing this for over years now. And I think more than 5 or 6 Gate report had always made that policy recommendation that we should look into this. And thanks also to Mr. Ayer, who started this from the Gate side to start the options and analysis of some of the context as well. First of all, the underlying issue that your presentation mentioned was for the fact that we do not have a capable tax administration to be able to do a better job and then ensure that assessment to these companies are done in a very, let me say, very good or very well, done manner. The challenge is, one, we have always talked about the Revenue Authority not doing the right job because, one, even if we increase royalty by 1%, automatically it reduces the propensity to pay tax because the royalty will be deductible. We deduct it before the company start, paying the tax. So in all, if you put all of them in one bowl, you see that you are just taking this up front and losing this at the back. And I still say the main challenges, if you want to improve, as Mr. You said, is for the Revenue Authority, because we have chosen a fiscal regime that will leave a lot to corporate tax, which is 35%. And in that corporate tax, to be able to get more from that corporate tax, you need a Revenue Authority, first of all, who will have a very clear tax audit manual, very clear to the companies that these are the allowable and disallowed expenses. And those things, and I always compare that to the UK, for instance. You won't go to HMRC and you determine for HMRC what is allowed and what is not allowed. Because everything is published on HMRC's website. And a very common person can go to HMRC's website and know that if I spent on an airplane from Accra to Takwa, only the workers who are working on the project that I have contract on will be the one that will be allowed. And not all other workers, whether you are consulting for the company on another project, you will not be allowed to do that, to deduct. And I think that is where the challenge is. So I like the proposal of the variable royalty rate, and I think it's been in Burkina for a long time. And we should explore that. And that, I think, Tom, when you say you didn't consider additional profit tax, the variable royalty rate itself is an additional profit tax. Because once the price increases, and we hope that profitability increases, because that's the very good yardstick, automatically we will be getting more, and we will be stick at 3 or 5% flat rate. So I think that we should explore, take this forward, do further analysis on how that will impact the existing mines and any new mine. Not the competitiveness. I think we are very competitive. From what Dr. Steve said, we have almost all the basics that would let every company to choose as compared to our landlocked countries. And so that one we don't have a problem with. But I think we should do analysis on how that will impact the mines and see whether it will not be that significant or even reduces their ability to work. Then we can put this proposal forward to further stakeholders and then some to the cabinet for consideration. But my take would be that whether increase in royalty or staying at a higher corporate tax, it has to do with the tax administration. And we need to be very clear. We will try to build their capacity. We need to be clear on the manuals. We need to be clear on the audit that we give to the companies. Very clear audit manual that this is allowable, this is not allowable. And you don't determine for us. For instance, currently, we know that most companies will do corporate social responsibility and deduct. And because there is a confusion between state agencies, between Minerals Commission and also the GRE as to who approved that. I think once we are very clear and transparent on these things, we will be able to get more money even in the corporate social, the corporate tax that we have at 35%.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Bashiru Abdurazak from the Ghana EITI Secretariat. I think just to begin from where Samir has ended, in terms of the tax administration, I do know that, in fact, just yesterday, someone was in our office from the Ministry of Finance. In fact, they have been doing some work regarding the mining sector. And so some current exercise that is being undertaken reveals some, I think, issues with regard to the way the tax system is in the country. And so that work that is being done about a number of, in fact, one company reveals, in fact, some level of discrepancy between what the company has paid and what government has even received and what GRA itself has reported. And so the need to strengthen our tax system is key in terms of building the capacity. And there's also another issue that I want to find out from Tom Scafford. In your analysis, I don't know whether you have taken into consideration to look at maybe the level of financial obligation on the part of government if government decides to adopt the current proposal that GATE is making, in terms of how much government will contribute towards taking part, an active part in the mines. So I don't know if you have done some, or you can do some research to also tell us how much government will need to contribute towards that. Exactly, to acquire a stake in the mines. And then the last one that is about the variable royalty rate. I know some work has also been done with by the IMF, and I know some discussions are also ongoing between the IMF and then I think the government of Ghana in terms of, and I know that the Minerals Commission is also involved in this, in terms of this variable royalty rate. But my question to Tom is, I don't know, this for me, this is my opinion though, seem to create some kind of or level of uncertainty to inform government, fiscal planning purposes. Because if you vary this thing, in fact, and you want to plan for, if you don't have a very strong forecasting system, that will tend to either undermine or overstate, or understate or overstate the numbers, and that will certainly pose a problem for government into the future. Thank you.
Tom.
Yes.
So, I mean, there are a number of questions. Some of them are actually comments. So you can take those ones, and after this, I think we are done with those inside the room here. We can then move online for just a round of questions, and we will be wrapping up. There are more questions here.
Yeah.
Anyway, but we will move to virtual, and then if we have to come back, but it's still better that way. So, Tom, if you can take the answers for this, then we will go online and come back. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot for those comments and questions, all very thought-provoking. Firstly, just to say to Mr. Ari's comment about sort of the assumptions and how they've impacted the results, I'm very happy to share the model that I used for this analysis with you all alongside the slide deck. So you can see for yourselves how we got to these results, and also look at other assumptions and regimes and reform options to figure out sort of the best way forward for Ghana. So I'll do a bit of tidying up of the model, but then we'll happily share it with you, and I'll discuss with Nazir the best way to do that. But in terms of what your question on what should you do about existing mines? Well, I mean, so just to reiterate, I think given those development agreements have only been recently renegotiated, I really would sort of caution the government to go ahead and try and revise those. But And instead of that, it could look, as I sort of set out in relation to state equity, it could look at ways to ensure that when it comes to state equity, at least, it starts to generate more benefits from that by, again, looking at those governance arrangements. So not changing the development agreements, but changing how that state equity is approached. But if the government is keen to relook at those development agreements, I would just say look at sort of my proposed regimes as a package, and I guess this also goes to Samuel's point as well around railway rate royalty and the impact on existing mines. I think as a package, given the positive impact of offsetting those levies on a mine's economics, the combination of those reforms maybe would be seen as acceptable, some variant on them by companies, even those with development agreements. But I guess that is something for the government to consider, given it's got a lot more information than me about the situation there. But yeah, feel free to use my model to look at the potential impact on some of those mines with different regimes. But yeah, on the whole, I would suggest, given how recently those development agreements were renegotiated, the potential risk for Ghana of renegotiating them and deterring investment both in the future gold mines, but also in the bauxite and iron ore sectors, which I know the government is keen to attract. That really needs to be weighed up against the potential benefits of renegotiating those agreements. Then when it comes to variable rate royalty, I guess to the comments of both Samuel and the gentleman from Gaiety, is, well, great to hear that a variable rate royalty is already being considered. I think it is a useful tool for introducing some flexibility into a regime without reducing its simplicity. But I would just clarify, you're not, when you increase the royalty rate, you're not sort of just moving money from the corporate income tax to the royalty rate. Given, I take your point that you do deduct royalty from taxable income, but given the corporate income tax is only 35, only as in 35%. So for every $1 of profit, the government is only getting 35 cents of that. You will still, by having a royalty rate of $1 higher, you're still going to end up with more money from the royalty rate than you had done previously, and getting that from corporate income tax. So it is a shift of where the money's coming from, but it's not a like for like. You would still get more money from the royalty. So yeah, looking at how this impacts the economics of the different mines is important, but we did look at that for the more profitable mine and the less profitable mine, and we think that there shouldn't be too much of there shouldn't be an impact on viability for most mines that are sort of possible within Ghana's mining sector.
All right. So thank you so much. I think we have only one hand up from our virtual participants. I think that's BCD or Kansi. Sir, or if it is a lady, please kindly introduce yourself and go ahead with your question or comments.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not sure whether Nazir can.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much,
Yeah.
Thomas, for your presentation. Unfortunately, because I'm new to Microsoft Teams, I wasn't able to see any of your presentations. But I heard exactly what you said. My comment is partly on the Minerals and Mining Act. It is based on Section 43. In fact, all what you are talking about is based on Section 43 of the Minerals and Mining Act, that the government has 10% free carried interest in the rights and obligations of mineral operations, with respect of which no financial payment is made by government. Over the years, this has been interpreted to mean that to mean the right to 10% dividends declared by mining companies. But it is the opinion of some that this interpretation is not supported by the Minerals and Mining Act. Why do people say so? That one, the 10% free carried interest with no government contribution can also mean 10% of production. And secondly, it can also mean 10% of the after-tax profits, which government is entitled whether dividends are declared or not. So this is why something that if Section 43 of the Minerals and Mining Act is reviewed, then we would declare as to exactly what government is entitled to, but that it should not be tied to the declaration of dividends by the mining companies. So there's also the opinion that the free carried interest that is mentioned there, is it really free carried? Is it free interest? 10% free interest? Well, we can say that it is not free. And so that is why that portion of the law has to be modified. The state actually is granted the interest in consideration for a contribution in kind. And what is that contribution? That is the granting of the mining lease or the mining right to the mining companies. So it is better for the section to be restated. If that is restated, then it means therefore that 10% is not free carried interest. It is really money or something that can be a share that can be monetized. We can give what you call the value to it. So that is my contribution. One other thing that I want to mention is that which Mr. Bekwe mentioned in his submission is something that I want to correct. That tax administration is based solely on the tax law. Tax administration is based solely on the tax law. The tax audit that is done is based on the tax law. So royalty, for instance, is tax deductible. It is stated in the law. When we Section 81 of the Income Tax Act, it is there. And other deductible allowances, they are all there. So, and even corporate social responsibility is in the law. So let's don't confuse ourselves, or let's not think that it is, the problem is, there's a problem coming from the tax administration. Tax administration is based on law, and it can already be reviewed by others. So let me bring that point clear. Another issue is that the manufacturing sector, that is where we have what we call it, local industry incentives or rural industry incentives. Mining companies or extractive companies do not have those incentives because it is seen as a special industry. It has its own incentives. So whether we set up mining company in the rural area or whatever, or in Accra or whatever, it has the same incentives and the tax, what do you call it, corporate tax. So let's get to clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think this is one reason why I insisted we should know who is speaking. I've just been informed that the person who just spoke used to be the head of the mining desk at GRA. And so he's coming from a very informed position. And that's why I think it is important that when you want to speak, please let us know where you are coming from. Then people will begin to understand you from your background and the context that you are speaking from. But thank you so much, Senior. Now, I think Mr. Suleiman Koni's hand is also up. I'll allow him to come in now. Much of the former speakers' positions are all suggestions trying to it was commentary, not really a question. That's how come I'm not asking Tom to go into this. So, Mr. Suleiman Okoni, if you can come in, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and I really appreciate Tom for the wonderful presentation. My name is Suleiman Okoni, Ghana Chamber of Mines. My colleague Chris should be in the room there. And Bash, thank you so much for sending the link to me. I really enjoyed the presentation. I think we'll try and make time to have a deeper go at it, just to be sure that we really understand every aspect of the presentation. My take is actually from a different perspective, and the mining industry is a finite one. The resources are not replaceable, and therefore, when you see experts present about the mining industry in our dear country, and you see potentially sharp decline in production, we at the Ghana Chamber of Mines get worried. Yes, we want to see sustained production, and therefore, when you see elements of uncompetitiveness, elements of high cost, yes, I can understand why in the mix of the variables that investors will look at, it is not just the cost. But essentially, when you see that the costs stick up like a sore thumb within the sub-region, you want to ask yourself questions, especially when you also have, related to that, declining investment in exploration. So yes, we are seeing a potential, decline in production. And at the same time, what would assure us of a commercial find, a pipeline of production, there again, we are not competitive. I get worried. And rather than asking what we can do to get a lot more out of the mining industry, we are sitting at a space where potentially we may have an extinct mining industry. I think that should be the focus of our conversation. How do we make sure that we have a sustained production of mineral products within the country? I get very worried, and it's one of the concerns we have as a Ghana Chamber of Mines, to say this is an extractive industry. The mineral resources are not replaceable. Yes, it is good to have conversations about how we can, monetize a dividend, so to speak, or the so-called free carried interest, of the state. But if you don't, if the foundation of the industry is at risk, it is threatened. For us, that is where we should be addressing. How do we ensure that we grow the industry in the face of potential decline? You look at all the elements, and someone would say you're a matured industry. But as a student of marketing, if you have a product which is matured, you should not be clapping. If you look at a generic PLC, product life cycle, effectively after maturity, you go into decline. So the key question is that if you don't want to decline, what do you want to do? What are your strategies around changing the natural course of events for your industry? I have not heard that, and I think it would be good for us to address these, even as we want to have engagement conversations to say, what can we do to probably help us get a lot more? But the fundamentals tend to be quite weak, at least from the presentation of Tom. And I like the issues, the back and forth regarding whether you want to increase, government should buy a lot more, shares, and the question is to what end. And I saw the conversation between Dr. Steve Mantel and Tom. Very interesting conversations. So you buy into and you increase your stake. You buy more equity. But if no dividends are declared and you have larger shares in there, what do you get? I think it is fundamental for us to understand how the industry operates. And again, it's about sustaining capital, the need for sustained capital, and why mining companies would always want to plow back, to go back into investment, to explore, do brownfield exploration, sometimes greenfield exploration. These are conversations we need to have. It's about sustaining the industry. Again, related to that has to do with governance. And it's all the things we've spoken about all the time. Who do we put on boards? And Tom, thank you very much for raising this fundamental issue. Sometimes you raise this and nobody wants to confront it. People just shy away from it. What is the criteria? Are there clear-cut criteria for nominating people to the boards? What are their qualifications? What experiences do they have? What are the matching orders from government to these persons? Do they report back? We don't know. And effectively, it's like job for the boys. Who do I know? Who do I think can do the work without any clear, criteria? And here I'm not speaking as an executive of the Ghana Chamber of Mines. I'm speaking as a Ghanaian because the resources belong to all of us. And the key question to ask ourselves is, if it were your business, your own personal business, is that how you're going to manage it? If you had your shop somewhere, would you just call anybody because the person is your friend to go and manage it, let alone a natural resource like the mining industry? So governance issues are so critical. And until and unless we have the right people, the right structures and arrangements around governance for the mining industry, would continue to complain and say that but things are not being done well, that we are not getting our due. Yes, there is dividend policy, but if government itself decides that this is what it wants to do, it can't persuade even one voice, one strong voice from government sitting on the board. I am sure it is not so much the numbers, but your ability and competence and to be persuasive on the board for government's views to be also considered. But I want to conclude by saying that the issues around the development agreements needs to be considered all the time. And it hurts me to think, and Tom, I'm not too sure whether you looked at the numbers, the cost of production of mining companies within the country segmented on the basis of whether a company has an investment agreement or not. And I think that's fundamental. So if on the ballpark, the average cost of mining in Ghana is higher than you have within the sub-region, trust me, if you are doing a segmented analysis, comparing those with investment agreement with those who don't have investment agreement, you would see what the cost of these are. Effectively, what you find in the case of Ghana is an average. And even if you have an average and the average shows that it is higher, then you should think about those who don't have investment agreements, who are paying all these levies, additional levies, which have been introduced because their fiscal regimes are not frozen compared to the others. And I shudder to think what an extra burden it will be on these companies. And whether these companies, and I'm speaking based upon fact, companies who have decided that, look, they want to reinvest some of their money back into development of new mines, some going underground, some expanding, because no mine will want to close, because we know that the costs and consequences of closing a mine. And yet, here we are thinking about how to increase the take of government, and in another sense, the cost of operations of mining companies. And I'm asking the question, because see, anything we try to introduce, you are sure that about 70% of production will be insulated. And these are the companies who have investment agreements. And therefore, those who are exposed, so to speak, so the Golden Star Resources and co, who effectively have higher costs of production, those are the ones who will be confronted with this new fiscal take. And I think that we just have to be measured and careful how we do this. Because if you look from where I started, it doesn't look good for us as a country. And we may say whatever that, yes, we have infrastructure, we have capacity, but it's the numbers. The numbers don't tell lies. The numbers don't tell lies. And I always make this point. A couple of years ago, I was in Burkina Faso for a conference. Ghana's High Commissioner then, Heather Cameron, pulled me to the side in Burkina Faso. She was also responsible for that country. And he said, Mr. Conde, when you go back, tell your guys in Ghana, we are risking and we are losing a lot of exploration investment going to Burkina Faso, because within the sub-region Burkina Faso, in spite of the security issues, in spite of the security challenges, in spite of the infrastructural gap, if you see the numbers going up, it should be a wake-up call for all of us. It should be. And I think that we need to think through how we can, unless we want to go by the classical product life cycle, where once you get into exploration, then all you do is to milk the cow. And once you milk the cow, it goes to a natural death. And I think we have to be careful about how we
Thank you
go about
so
this.
much.
Thank you
Thank you so much, Mr. Suleiman. The good thing is that the other hands that were up, they've all they've taken down their hands already. And so, but before you go, since you represent the voice of industry, Mr. Okanse made a statement that the interpretation placed on Section 43 of Act 703 at the moment may actually be limiting the scope of application of that particular provision to declaration of dividends, for example. What is your position from industry? Do you think that is a position you probably also embrace, or you think that for you, reading Section 43 only brings to mind the fact that government can only begin to think about getting some revenue only when dividends are declared? Then from there, if Tom has some comments around your commentary, he can make it. Before we come back to the venue here, and then we can close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bandrita. Unfortunately, I don't have the legislation in front of me. But if my memory serves me right, I think essentially what it talks about, that government would have a 10% free carried interest. It will have the rights and obligations, but it will not be contributory. So effectively, generally in the global mining industry, that is the interpretation. We are not an island, so it is not just what we believe is the law in Ghana. What it means is a global industry. Investors, they go across the world, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's the United States of America, whether it's Canada, South Africa, Burkina Faso. So we are not an island. And the key question to ask is, what is the general interpretation of this provision in the law? We are not the only country which has it in our laws. What is the general application? What is the general interpretation? And that is what government itself understands it to be. So Okanse has been on this circuit for a very long time, so many years. I'm surprised this is now coming up. When I believe when he was in the saddle, probably would have raised it. Those days when we were having a EITI meetings, we could bring a few other minds to it and have those conversations and debates, because that is the understanding. Because if that's not the understanding, then companies cannot even model that into their fiscals. So the general understanding of the laws are exactly how companies will take it and model them before they make the investment decision. But you don't wait for companies to make an investment decision and then you're raising issues about interpretation. Probably what we are doing is more academic than anything else. If it is, then I can understand. But that is the general rule. That is how investors would understand that clause. And like I'm saying, that clause is not unique in our minerals.
Thank you so much for your reaction to that. So, Tom, if you have any thoughts around all of what has been said, you can come in now. Then we can come back here for the last round of questions, and then we can bring this to closure. So if you don't have anything, I can come back here. If they have questions, then you can take all of them together, if that's okay.
Well, I'll maybe just come back briefly on Mr. Coney's comments first. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, really comprehensive feedback. And I agree, yeah, the prospects for investment are very mixed. If you look at the various factors that I've set out in the slide deck, but I do think that the reform package that we've set out should balance both the concerns of the government to generate more revenue from its state equity, or at least find another instrument for generating revenue instead, with reducing some of the burden on investors, particularly on the higher cost mines. So I I think the levy offset would have a very positive impact. I also, and this is kind of in the endnotes of the slide deck, which you'll see when I share them, I also think the current discussions between the government and Gaiety around removing VAT during the exploration phase is a really positive step. I think when you look at sort of across the region experience there, it's quite common for countries to exempt companies from VAT during the exploration phase. It has a very positive impact on the potential for exploration without having a huge hit on government revenues. So I think that's a bit of a no-brainer. So I think that package where you're looking for ways to reduce the cost of exploration, reduce the burden on higher cost mines, but looking at reforming state equity to generate a bit more certainty around the government's revenue streams, hopefully is a package that strikes the right balance. But yeah, happy to discuss it further with you at another stage, and yeah, we'll share the slide deck and the model with everyone on this in this meeting, so you can kind of see for yourselves what the impacts of the different reforms are.
All right, thank you so much. So we come back here to take the last round of questions, at most 3, so that we can can get back home as quickly as possible. So if there are further questions, yes, okay, yeah. So please, okay, Angie is not here, so you take this.
All right, thank you. So my name is Christopher from the Ghana Chamber of Mines. Like my boss, Mr. Suleiman Ukoni, rightly said, this is a very excellent presentation, and oh no, I mean I am particularly impressed with the objectivity and the rigor of the analysis. So my intervention is just to speak to Dr. Mantiao's question around the exploration phase, and as well as the issues on competitiveness. So like Tom rightly pointed out, if you look at the Fraser Institute report, there are 2 parameters that we use in assessing how competitive a country is when it comes to attracting investments. One, of course, looks at the geological information as well as the environment that you operate in. And again, like the report rightly stated, the geological information constitutes about 60% of the persons that were surveyed, their decision to invest in a country or not, and the other 40 relates to the policy-related factors. So now the key question then becomes, then what becomes the pull factor for investment? Of course, it becomes the geology, and gold is gold, be it in Burkina, in Mali, or Cote d'Ivoire. That becomes the deciding factor. But if it comes to the policy environment as well, tax, of course, is important, but it's not the only determining or deciding factor. I always say that if you want to look at how investors react to taxes, just look at how the small-scale miners have reacted to the 3% that we put in place for them. Last year, they did about 1.5 million ounces of gold. This year, if we do 100,000 ounces of gold, it's just a miracle, just because of how the 3% tax that was introduced. That's streamlining, but they see how they're also reacting to it. So I just want us to make the point that if it comes to competitiveness, in as much as the geological information is important, the policy environment is important as well. For geology, we don't have control over it. What we have control over is the policy environment, and that's something that we can position to be able to attract investments. And again, like my boss rightly stated, when we are looking at how well the country is performing when it comes to mining, our focus is on what we are able to bring in and how well the output is growing. So if you realize, or if you pay very key attention to our sector, if you take out the small scale sector, the mining sector is just giving you about 70-65% maximum. And if you do the annual year-on-year change for output coming from the small scale, from the large scale sector, you realize that the curve slopes downwards. What we are interested in is the rate of change. It's sloping downwards, meaning that it's a decline or almost flat. The growth we see in the Ghana's output typically originates from the small scale sector. So if you are to compare our large scale sector with Burkina, with South Africa, or with Mali, potentially we may not be the leading country when it comes to gold. And all of the investments that come with it, we may not also get it as well. So when we are looking at competitiveness, that is the angle from which we look at it. Thank you, Doc. The small scale sector, we have always said, is a good example of what a Ghanaian can do. So if we can encourage the small scale miners to grow to become an Anglo Ashanti or a Newmont, and even go out of the country, it's to our credit. So that's something that we really, really support. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Oh, okay. It appears, okay. Then after Dr. Mantia, I think we should bring this to a closure.
Yeah. Mine is actually not a question, but just to thank NRGI for the support thus far, because we started this with getting one of the Gaiety MSG members, Mr. Ayi, to do an initial draft of this policy brief for engagement with the relevant stakeholders. As EITI, we have always approached issues from a very pragmatic position. So we bound this with our members, engaged the Ministry of Finance Management. Chamber had the opportunity to speak to some of the proposals. They raised some certain fundamental concerns. The MSG took a decision to refer the issues raised by the chamber to a smaller committee for review and to narrow down the options. Now, the NRGI analysis has come to strengthen some of the decisions that was taken by the technical committee in terms of giving us more empirical data in support of some of the decisions taken to drop certain proposals. We've always made it clear to all our stakeholders that the intent of the policy proposal is not to overburden the mining industry. So anything that would burden them in terms of their bottom line is to be dropped. And so we've moved to a point where I think this presentation will go back to a technical committee and we'll review it and see the way forward for our proposals for optimizing our revenue to government. But in the long run, we believe that there are certain things that we need to do as a country if we want to optimize benefits. A lot of the times we tend to focus so much on the revenues, but there is much more benefit to derive from our mineral sector if we focus attention on building local capacity and aligning the mining list, the 28 items listed in our local content regulations that are to be procured locally. What we need to do as a country is to establish or develop the manufacturing capability to be able to supply these items to the industry, and that will give us much more money and also job opportunities for our youth and value retention than we are getting in terms of revenues flowing from the fiscal regime. So we thank NRGI for giving us, and of course, new proposals have been tabled in this study by NRGI, and the technical committee of the MSG, the multi-stakeholder group of the EITI, will look at this. Perhaps we may want to drop all the other options and opt for some of these new proposals. You never know. Thank you very much, and we'll continue to count on your support.
Thank you, Tom. You have some any additional comments to all of the issues raised? Otherwise, we will just go to the last one. I think Dr. Mantia has virtually done the part of Gaiety. We could just also speak to our part and then. So, Tom, if you have some comments, final comments, let's have them, and then we can bring closure.
No final comments other than just to thank you all again for giving up a few hours of your time in your very busy schedules. It's really, really appreciated. And thank you for all the the thought-provoking comments and questions. Really look forward to continuing to engage with you on this, and always here if you have sort of follow-up questions after the session. So yeah, just thanks again for your time, and hopefully the next time or at some point in the future when we're talking about tax in Ghana, I can actually be there in person with you. But yeah, thanks, and hopefully be in touch with you soon.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think Tom deserves a big round of applause. He's done so well, and thank you so much for your time. And thanks to all the Gaiety members as well as Chamber of Mines who have joined, and all other Ghanaians who think that this was so important for them to also contribute to, who joined virtually. We thank you so much. But what next after this engagement? Are there any opportunities for collaboration in this and other activities in 2020? Of course, from the NRGI side, we are committed to supporting Gaiety MSG in this particular journey. I mean, anything that is relating to this, NRGI would be, standing behind you, working together. We are not imposing our opinions. We will only do our analysis and leave, because you are the decision maker. You have to decide which of the options that you prefer. But we can only support with technical analysis and, to enrich whatever proposals you may have. So we are not prescribing, we are only trying to support in terms of technical. So I think Gaiety should take it from that perspective and not think that NRGI is trying to prescribe for them. So in terms of collaboration, as I indicated, for this we are solidly behind. For other opportunities that may come up, we would also be supporting, provided we get to know early and plan and include it in our work plan for 2022. That way it is easier for us to be able to engage without problem. But let me just take the opportunity to remind all members. I'm sure we all know that on Thursday we have another engagement. Bash, I don't know whether we have already informed members again about the Thursday engagement. That had to do with the engagement on the recommendations of Gaiety reports. It's just for tomorrow next. Yes, I mean on the schedule. Yes. Oh, honestly, I thought the invitation letters had gone to you because we are just dealing with you. That's my, but that is just the issue because we need to have this. Yes. We have already booked the hotel and everything. So if we don't, I don't know how it is going to work.
It will come, definitely come.
Thank
In
you
fact,
so
they are
much.
already aware.
Thank you
it's
for
just
confirming.
to give them official invitation letter to seal off. Because
Okay.
some of them sometimes will require, what do you call it, their offices or bosses to release them for such meetings.
I understand.
Yeah. So
Otherwise, I just thought that I should use the opportunity to remind us, since it's just 2 days.
No, it's good. Yeah, it's a good reminder. Yes, thank you.
It will be Thursday in the morning. Originally, we were looking at Alisa. Unfortunately, it has already been booked. So, but we've gotten a Mensvik. Angela, please confirm for me it's Mensvik. Exactly, Mensvik. In the morning, from 9:30 a.m. onwards, the program will start. And it should be just about 2 hours, between 2 and 3 hours, we are done. Thank you so much for coming once more. We are most grateful. I think we have some snacks outside. It was supposed to be a health break, but we thought that we should just take it all and then take the health. Thank you so much for coming. Joining virtual, you can sign out. We are done. So thanks so much. Yeah. And please be assured that we will send the presentation to you in addition to whatever you may require. Just let us know. But the presentation will be sent to you by tomorrow. Thank you. Those online, if we don't have your emails, you can send to the Gaiety coordinator. It will help us to be able to send all this to you. Thank you.